Good morning, everyone. Very glad to be with you today. If you would, go ahead and open up your Bibles to Genesis chapter 21. That will be where we start this morning, Genesis chapter 21. But before we get into the text, let's do some review because we're about to get into one of the crucial moments. We've been looking at the life of Abraham, who is the first of the three patriarchs or fathers of the nation of Israel. And we've been building up to the next, which is Isaac. So we're at a crucial changing point in the early history of Israel. So, to review, why is it important that we study the Old Testament?
They can better understand the New Testament.
Exactly. When you're trying to translate a text, you don't use the smaller to understand the bigger. You use the bigger to understand the smaller because the bigger has more information. And Jesus talks about the Old Testament as it being the way to understand who he is. In Luke chapter 24, verse 27, we've looked at this verse plenty of times. Who would you read that for us? Or can you see it with that? Are you good to read that? Or
In the beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expanded to them all the scriptures, the things concerning himself.
thank you. And then Paul says in Romans 15 and verse 4,
For whatever things were written before were written for our learning, that we, through the patience and comfort of the scriptures, might have hope.
so I've mentioned this in our very first class, but as a reminder, there are 1,189 chapters in the Bible. And out of that almost 1,200 chapters, 929 of them are the Old Testament. So there's a lot of very important things that we need to learn, and there's continual references in the New Testament to the stories that are the accounts that we are looking at right now. And Abraham is going, these chapter 21 is going to be referenced many times as a historical account on which a lot of things are based in the New Testament. And so it's very important that we understand these stories. Not stories. Brother Martin and I were just talking about that the other day about how we don't like it when people say that these are stories. They're not. These are historical events, and this is a record of those events. But of course, now that we talked about it, I'm going to say stories. But anyways, we've also talked about how there are 16 Bible periods, some divided into 17. But so far, we've gone through the creation and the flood period, and we're in the middle of the patriarchal period, which involves Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And now, what we've gone through in Abraham's life is years and years ago, in Genesis chapter 12, Abraham was given 6 promises. There were 3 that were going to affect him in his life immediately, and 3 that would be for later down the line. Those second 3, the most important of the 3, were that his future generations would inherit all of the land of Canaan. Then before that they would become a great nation that would be as many as the sand and the seashores and the stars in the sky. And then also eventually way down the line that through him all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. And we talked about what is that last one? How are all the nations blessed through Abraham's seed? Jesus. Jesus comes through their seed. And so this one man is being chosen by God, and there are going to be the greatest things ever to come from this relationship between Abraham and God. The greatest of all being Jesus Christ coming to this earth. So Abraham was told that he would have this great nation, but what was the problem that we came across?
He didn't have any heirs.
Yeah, he had no son. The closest thing was just a distant relative that would inherit all of his stuff. And so what we've seen so far is Abraham and Sarah have struggles with themselves and the doubting or just fearfulness that they don't have an heir. So first, what did they do?
concubine.
Provide one for themselves.
Right, they had a concubine. They had to help God do this. So Sarah offers Hagar as a handmaiden, and out of that relationship is born Ishmael. But God says, no, it's not Ishmael who's going to be the son of promise. Then in chapter 17, God says, who is going to be the son of promise? Isaac. But importantly, there are some very big distinctions that God made with this promise. It was going to be through Sarah. That was very important. Sarah, the woman, was just as important as Abraham, the man, was in the parenthood of this child. So God says, it's you and it's Sarah, and it's going to be Isaac. And yet, still, that was in chapter 17. Years go by before anything actually happens. And in chapter 18, they're told again, and Sarah and Abraham laugh. Well, Abraham laughs before, but Sarah laughs this time. This seems crazy to them. They're too old to have children at this point. And when we get to chapter 21, they're 190 years old. Well, one is 100 and one is 90. And so well beyond typical childbearing age, even in a time where they lived longer than we did. And the promise has still had no conceivable heir. And we even talked about a little bit how when it was in chapter 17, Abraham thought that since it had been so long, Ishmael could have been the heir because God had left them for so many years with Ishmael and no recurrence or anything said about Isaac. Again, now we come to the point where all of this is going to be concluded. So, chapter 17, about 13, 14 years ago, this is promised that it's going to be Isaac through Sarah. And here we come to chapter 21. Now, are there any questions about anything we've gone over in Abraham's life before we get to this?
I want to make just one comment.
Yeah.
I was talking to my sister, and I was talking about reading the Bible, and she said, well, I love reading the Old Testament. She has a Muslim family, and that is why she won't admit to the New Testament. She won't admit that Jesus is the Son of God. Ishmael. And so I was thinking, because a lot of young people now are not aware of Jesus. They're aware of the Old Testament, but they're not aware. And I'm gonna start telling myself, well, don't stop in the old. If you don't go to the new, you ain't gonna make it.
It's true. And that's an important point too, is that there are a lot of people, Islam is the second biggest religion in the world, and their whole thing is which child did they come from? Ishmael. I would say is the child of promise, but the Old Testament says no, it's not Ishmael. Ishmael will be blessed, he'll have this great nation. We see that that's true, but that's not the child of promise. You miss that, you're missing the rest of the Old Testament. If you're trying to follow, I mean, the Old Testament does reference Ishmael from here on occasionally, but the story isn't. Yes?
You need to clarify that. Islam is not tied to Islam. There are people from all cultures and nations and nationalities that profess Islam.
Right, right. The religion itself.
All the children of Abraham and from all the children of Ishmael and people that weren't even from the lineage of Abraham.
Yeah, you're right about that.
That came from the Ishmael.
Hmm. And they would say that it's important that the Ishmael got the promise, right?
There are Chinese that are Muslim.
Right, and I wasn't like there are all different
You
cultures.
hear that a lot, and you're like, wait a minute,
Yeah,
you need to open your eyes. There's a lot of people in the Philippines that are Muslim.
right, right. There are all different people from different backgrounds, but it originates from what they would say comes from that. And Muhammad made it a big point to emphasize Ishmael's importance. Any other thoughts? Okay, well, let's get into chapter 21 of Genesis. So we come to this first section, verses 1 through 3, and this is actually when Isaac is officially born. This is 1 year after the events of chapter 17. So all of the things in between happened in the span of a year. And it says in verse 1 that God visited Sarah. I'd like to point out that whenever the Bible talks about visiting, it's not just that you go over and spend time with someone or just hang out. The word is conveying that you go over to fix something or you're there to help with something. It's not just that God went to hang out with Sarah. Whenever it says that God visited this certain person, he's going to change something. He's helping them or fixing something in some way. And so it says that God visits Sarah. And what is he doing in this situation when he's visiting them? What is he helping or fixing? Right, they're conceiving a child. So Sarah and Abraham have a child. Sarah is 90, as we mentioned, and Abraham is 100 years old, and they call his name Isaac, which means laughter. So this is, I like that they called him Isaac, because one, originally they both laughed out of a doubting. But now, once he is born, it says they have laughed out of joy and out of amazement. And so he is a child of laughter. His name is Isaac. And that's described in verse 6. And so finally, after all that we've discussed for all these weeks, God has kept his promise, and now there was a true heir to all the promises that were given to Abraham. And I want to just stop for a minute. Let's think about what all it took for this to happen. Is there any way, based on what we've seen, that Abraham can claim that he got to this point on his own? No. Every victory that he won was a victory that all of the odds were pointed against him. And even when it came down to the very birth of his son, there could be no credit really given to Sarah or Abraham because, yes, it was a natural birth in one way, but it was a miracle that it happened so long after the childbearing age. So this whole time, God is bringing them along with him. And it's apparent from the life story of Abraham that he could do nothing without God's constant grace, mercy, and patience. That's another reason why it's so important for us to look at these stories in the Old Testament, because that's the same thing for us. It's the we could do nothing without the constant grace, mercy, and patience of God continuing to move us forward. So God in chapter 21, after many years of helping Abraham realize certain things, bringing him through tragedies, helping him to stop lying about his sister. All of this has been slowly molding Abraham into the man we're going to see in the account of Genesis chapter 22. But it is also a good reminder of a phrase that is repeated in different words that God is not slack concerning his promises. Even if it doesn't happen in the timeline that we think it should happen, there's a reason for whatever God's timeline is. In Abraham's case, we can see that he needed a lot of opportunities to grow in the faith towards God. In the case of redemption, where the verse actually says God is not slack concerning his promises, but now requires all men everywhere to repent, Acts 17:30, we may be thinking, I want God to come back now. Why hasn't he come back? All of these different reasonings in our head. God always has a reason for the timeline he's following. And we see that in Abraham. And so we can trust that even though it may be a while, God is going to come to that conclusion of his promise. And in our case now, the reason he's waiting is because he wants everyone who can to come to him. Now, before we get into what happens to Ishmael now that Isaac is born, does anyone have any thoughts or questions on these first few verses? Okay, so verses 8 through 21 is if you remember what we've talked about already, how did Sarah and Hagar feel about each other? They did not like each other. And that's not speculation. That's not, this is from the text. They despised each other. Hagar despised Sarah, and Sarah abused Hagar. This is not a happy relationship, but Sarah's tolerated him or tolerated her. Why would that be the case? Because up till now, they haven't had a son. Ishmael has been the only heir that they've had. And so, even though we can see Sarah clearly did not like the situation, they left him around, and Abraham became close to Ishmael in this time. But Sarah goes up to Abraham, and what happens?
She tries to get him to send them away, send Hagar away.
Yeah. And in this situation, there's actually good reason for Sarah to want to send Hagar and Ishmael away, because it seems like the anger between the two women has translated down into the sons. Because what is Ishmael doing to Isaac? Who said that?
He was mocking.
He's mocking him. There's this great feast. They're all coming together, and Sarah looks over and sees Ishmael mocking poor little Isaac, who was just a child at this point. And if we look over at Galatians chapter, let's see, I have it up here. Yeah, Galatians chapter 4 and verse 29. This is talking about Hagar and Sarah, Ishmael and Isaac. And talking about Ishmael and Isaac, it says, "But as he who is born according to the flesh then persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, even so it is now." This is talking about, although it is applying it to us today, this is talking about Hagar's son Ishmael persecuting Sarah's son Isaac. They were fighting at this time. He was clearly doing things that, I mean, it was just as if the relationship between Sarah and Hagar had just been passed down to the next generation, which is also something that still happens today when there's animosity between parents. But anyways, not only now were they fighting against each other, even though Isaac was too young to really do anything at this point, their future generations are going to continually be fighting against each other, the Ishmaelites and the Israelites. But now we get back to Sarah in the account here, and she sees all of this happening, and she asks Abraham to send Hagar out of the camp in verse 10. And this made Abraham sad because why? Verse 11. Yeah, he loved him. Abraham really is a loving guy, as we're going to see, to those who are in his family, because remember the story, the things that happened with Lot, and now we see it with Ishmael, and we're going to see it next chapter with Isaac. He's a very loving and kind man, and so he sees that this relationship is going poorly, and he's saddened by the fact that he's going to have to send them out. And so he gathers them some things, some water and some food, and sends them out of the camp. But God assures him what in this time?
He will make a nation of them.
Right. So Abraham is sad. He doesn't really want to do it. God comes and talks to him and says, "Go ahead and do it, but don't worry. As I promised you before, and as I promised Hagar, I'm going to take care of Ishmael. It's all going to be okay. He's going to become a great nation." So Abraham obeys God by sending them out in verse 14. So now Hagar and Ishmael are wandering out in the wilderness, and this is a famous painting of Hagar and Ishmael for this specific story. And what happens when they're out?
Run out of water.
Yeah. And what does Hagar do?
Cries out to God.
Sorry, what?
Cries out to God.
Yeah. So they're in this journey in the wilderness, which we don't really know exactly where they're going at this point. And they run out of all their supplies, and Hagar thinks they're going to die. This is a desperate cry to God. It's so bad to the point that Hagar actually puts Ishmael away, and in the Bible account, she goes over there to the other side of that bush so she doesn't have to watch her son die. That's how bad the situation is. Or in her mind, that's how bad the situation is. And so she cries out to God. And let's see, Julie, would you read verse 17 and 18? What God says?
And God heard the voice of the lad. Then the angel of God called to Hagar out of heaven and said to her, "What ails you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is. Arise, lift up the lad and hold him with your hand, for I will make him a great nation."
So this hour of desperation, she's thinking, these are my last moments. And again, like before, Hagar cries out to God. And God responds and says, don't worry. And then he directs her, he literally says, look up. And there's a well right in front of her, which it's a little comical, you're dying of thirst. And if you had only looked forward, you would have seen the well. And there's some commentators that want to make it a story of faith, whether Hagar's faith was wavering or not, and she would have found the well on her own. But I think that Hagar's prayer to God in her most desperate moments is a showing of faith in God, and God rewarded her. Do you have something?
This is very trivial, but normally it's the man that can't say something and the wife can sort it out.
That's true. That is actually true. You made a joke about that the other day, and Esther was looking at me because it had happened like 4 times that week. But anyways, we get back to the text, and I like to just take another moment to think about Hagar. What nationality was she? Egyptian. Would she have known the God of Israel, of Abraham in Egypt? Right. She wouldn't have known him from Egypt. She learned that from Abraham's influence in the camp. She learned the fear of God from being in that family, from seeing the blessings of God, and she came to trust him even at her worst moments. And so God reassures them that they have no need to fear because he is with them. And as we've seen time and time again, God is going to keep his promises no matter what the situation looks like to man, even if it looks very desperate. God has that plan for his promises that he's going to keep. And so he says again that he was with them in verse 20, and it says that Ishmael grew and he became an archer, and he married a woman from Egypt, which we can assume is from the influence of Hagar. All right, any questions on that? Okay, verses 22 through 34, we have this account of the well and Abimelech. What happens here? Well, first of all, let's start out. Who's Abimelech? Do we remember from last time? Yeah, he's a king of the Philistines, their early encampments. And so what happens with Abraham and Abimelech this time?
Dispute over the well.
Yeah. So they already had kind of a rocky relationship because does anyone remember what Abraham did to poor Abimelech at the time?
Oh, that was with Sarah.
Yeah. Yeah, he told him the same thing he told the Pharaoh, and he almost got Abimelech killed. But God tells us Abimelech is a man of integrity, a good man who gets blessed by God and Abraham later on. And so I don't think personally I'd have the greatest feelings about Abraham if I was Abimelech anyway. But everything is supposed to be settled, and they're in this land, and they come to this well, and there's it is almost like you could see a war building up if something wasn't done. And so what does Abraham and Abimelech do? What do they do here? Yeah, they come together and make a peace agreement. And I like this. It's really made up to be an official thing because who else is with the king when he meets Abraham? Not exactly. Starts with a C and ends with Amander. The commander of all the armies. So we have the king and this commander. Yeah, the chief captain of all the armies coming up and meeting with Abraham. Now, that wouldn't normally happen unless you're a man of great importance. Abimelech knows that Abraham, well, do you remember what God called Abraham to Abimelech? A prophet. He is God's prophet. He knows that this is the mouthpiece of God. He knows that Abraham is very important. for whatever God has going on. And so this is an event where there's great respect. And this is called Beersheba, which is going to become a very important place. More importantly, though, the chapter ends with Abraham calling on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God, as he's called here in verse 33. Despite all the flaws and failures that we've seen in the past, Abraham continually repents and turns back to God and is continually trying to be faithful to God, although we know he's gone back and forth in his doubting. But nobody starts out as the patriarchal figure Abraham that we know. Everyone has to start somewhere. Abraham has had his struggles, but we've seen him continue to grow. Now his faith has been concreted in chapter 21 when Isaac is born. And God is going to prove that to us and to all of those around him in chapter 22. But again, I mentioned that to show God's constant mercy, grace, and patience that allowed Abraham to get to the point where he is commended in the New Testament and where we get to be called the children of Abraham when we are faithful. Are there any questions about that?
I don't know if I mean, in the same vein that you're saying, I think God, and with Abraham, is building him, building his faith to the next chapter, which allows him to pass the test, if you will. So all these small little, we call them failures, or in our own lives, we think we fail, but as long as we go back to God, our faith is built and our connection with God is built, and that's really what God wants. He wants us to grow closer to God. And sometimes there are huge leaps that we have to take in faith, but most time they're little things that we don't even notice sometimes that are where God is working with us and testing us and producing in us a strong connection with Him.
Yeah, and that's exactly what he's doing is we're seeing little by little God building Abraham together to who he wants him to be with example and grace and mercy showing him you can still come back. And that's something that's very important to us still as Christians because yes, it's obviously better to not sin at all. But when you sin and turn back to God and are continually repenting, you can have, and He continually forgives you when you turn back to Him. You grow closer and closer to Him until you're at the point where you're hardly sinning at all, as we talked about a few weeks ago. And this is something we're going to be mentioning in our study for our worship period later. That's a good point. All right, so now we get to chapter 22. And this is one of the more famous accounts of Abraham, of the things that he did. And so in verses 1 through 8, we start the journey to Moriah. So there's clearly some time that passes between 21 and 22. If you know who the historian Josephus is, he estimates that Isaac may have been about 25 years old. But we don't know for sure. That's just based on the things that he had at the time, and that's what I'm going with for today's study. But again, I'm not saying that that's concrete. Let's just say about 25 years from now. But Isaac being a young man still, God calls Abraham in verse 1, and what does he say, or what does it say in verse 1 he's about to do?
Testing him.
Yeah, he's about to test him. And so he calls on Abraham, and Abraham responds, "Here I am," showing his readiness to listen to the Lord, the same thing that Elijah is going to tell Samuel to say later in his timeline when God calls on him, "Here I am." And what does God say? It's a pretty big ask,
Take Isaac to Moriah and offer him as a burnt offering.
right? So God comes up to Abraham however many years it is after Isaac is born, enough time for it to say that Abraham really loved Isaac, as it says when God is telling him, take the one who you love, Isaac, and sacrifice him. And he says, go sacrifice this son whom you've been waiting on for so long. And then he says, go over to Moriah and I'll show you where to do it later. So go to an unknown area that I'll show you. You're just going to have to follow my lead and sacrifice the son of promise that I've told you about since Genesis chapter 12. That's a huge ask. I mean, Abraham's already had some experience following God without knowing where he was going in the end. We've seen that in his earlier life. But this time he's following God, not knowing exactly where he's going, but knowing that wherever he ends up, he's going to have to sacrifice his son. And so I love verse 3 because we just talked about a little bit of how big of an ask that is. I don't have a son, so I can't even quite imagine how hard hearing that would be, but I know how it would feel to be told to do that about anyone else I love. But Isaac, the son of promise, told to sacrifice. And in verse 3, Abraham, seemingly without hesitation, what does it say in verse 3? Rises early in the morning and leaves. He's just going to do it. And so Abraham, with his servants, are going to go on a journey, and they're going to end up on Mount Moriah itself. But before they enter this circle of mountains, Abraham says for the servants who came with them to wait for his return, they would go alone. And by the way, this journey from where Abraham was to Mount Moriah is about a 3.5 day journey at their speed at the time. So you can just imagine, Isaac doesn't know what's going on yet, as we're going to see in the text. But they're going to sacrifice. They do know that. And they've brought all the supplies they need to eat and to drink. They've even brought the wood that's going to be burned on the altar and the things to build the altar. And they're traveling for 3 days going to sacrifice. But Isaac notices that something's missing. What's missing?
Animals for the sacrifice.
Yeah, the animal for the sacrifice. What does Abraham say about that?
God will provide.
Don't worry, the Lord will provide whatever is needed. You can imagine, though, how gut-wrenching it would have been for Abraham in those last few days on this long journey with his son and 2 other servants, knowing what's going down. But we'll talk about the Abraham's part in this a little bit more after we finish summarizing the story. But then it comes time that they're actually going to do the sacrifice. So in verse 9, Abraham and Isaac go up onto the mountain. They build this altar, and Isaac was bound and put onto the altar. It's interesting.
Just hold it right here.
Yeah.
All right. So my Bible, when I was young, had a picture of Isaac as a young boy. And so I always thought that was true. See, he's like 8 or 9 years old in this picture in my Bible. But now look up there. So, so no, I've never heard anybody talk about Isaac's faith because his father didn't wrestle him onto the sacrificial table there. He just must have said, okay, if this is what God says, I'm here for you.
And in that fact is very true that Isaac would have had to have faith in God in the first place about the animal. And I think it's interesting that in this account, we're not really given a lot of details of what actually has to go down between Abraham and Isaac. But you can imagine this was almost a respectful omission. Like, you don't really need to know the sad things that Abraham and Isaac had to talk about. You don't really want to think about what all that actually looked at. We just need the facts. And so a lot of times the Bible goes into great detail, but here, nothing at all. So that's a very interesting thing to think about. What really went down? How hard was this? What was said? But we don't know. All we know is that Abraham bound him, and the next thing is he's on the altar. And verse 10, Abraham has raised the knife and is about to do it. I had a picture, but I accidentally replaced it with a goat. I really don't know how it happened. But I had a picture of Abraham, I mean, it's not that he was raising a knife and hesitating over it. When it says that it was time and Abraham raised his knife, the indication is he made up his mind. This was happening. To him, his son was dead because he was going to do it like you would with any sacrificial animal. So this is the absolute last second. Abraham is about to put the knife into Isaac. And what happens?
God indwells him.
Yeah, the angel of the Lord, which, who have we said that is?
God.
God. And even possibly Jesus himself. But whatever the case is here, he stops Abraham at the last second so that there can be no doubt with anybody that Abraham was actually going to do this. And he says, stop. And Abraham looks up after seeing this, and this is the picture I meant for this part, but there it is twice. But he sees a ram caught in the bushes for sacrifice instead of Isaac. And so Abraham names the place that they are on Yahweh Yireh. And I believe some Bibles already have that translated as Yahweh provides or the Lord provides in verse 14. Does anyone have it already translated? To the Lord provides in verse 14. Yeah, the Lord will provide. Okay. So now that we've summarized the story, I want to spend a few minutes actually talking about the meaning and what Abraham had to go through. And to do that, let's turn to Hebrews chapter 11. We'll read this together. Okay, so again, just to briefly recap before we read, Abraham was asked to kill his only son of promise in a place unknown to him, the one that God brought to him miraculously at a late age, and the one that he loved, verse 2. And then he has to leave his home, but he does so without complaint. And the question I want to ask is, why does he do it without complaint? Why does he go along with it without saying anything to God? How could he do that? And the answer is he had total 100% faith in God's ability to keep his promises at this point. What does that mean? Hebrews 11. Brother Larry, would you read verses 17 through 19?
By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his own son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back.
That's amazing. Abraham had come to trust in God so much that he knew Isaac would inherit the promises no matter what. And so, in his faith, he concluded that God would raise Isaac from the dead. Where did that come from? We don't know. Because in the Bible account, this had never happened before. A lot of people think that raising people from the dead happened all the time in the Old Testament. Only happened 3 times. And it was years and years after Abraham. And so you've heard the phrase hoping against hope. That's what is said in the New Testament. Abraham came to the conclusion that no matter what it took, even if God had to raise Isaac from the dead, that it would be okay. Isaac was going to continue to receive those promises. And so the point is that Abraham had faith beyond what was even thought to be possible at the time. And I'd like to point out that Abraham had this faith throughout the whole event. We see it in verse 3 when he immediately got up the next morning early without any complaint or hesitation and walked off. We see it back in verse 5 when at the end, when he said to the servants, "We are going to leave," look at what it says at the end: "We will come back." He had no doubt that he was going to be returning home with his son Isaac, whatever that had to be. Is that not amazing? How far we can see Abraham has come? the type of faith that would seem impossible, something that would have no evidence for except for the fact that he believed God was powerful enough to do whatever it took. And I just love thinking this was a man who used to hide behind his sister, now trusting in God to raise his son from the dead if need be. And so after all of this, God promises that he's going to be richly blessed again, but he also renews the other promises of the land, nation, and seed. And the mountain which this happened on, Mount Moriah, is the same mountain purchased later by David, where an altar is built, and then the mountain where Solomon builds the temple. So this is going to be a place where a lot of major events happen, and this is the first one. Are there any thoughts on this section?
When you look at Romans 15:4 in the introduction to your lesson, talking about why was the Old Testament written, ultimately it's written for us to get the same conclusion Abraham did. As it talks about, in this you have hope. Well, that comes from the character of God. So ultimately, the Old Testament introduces us to God and his character. And when we get what Abraham gets, we got God's promise. It's done deal.
Yeah, exactly. When we have that kind of faith, which we should all strive to have, then it would be it would be no problem to believe that God is going to come back and we're all going to be with him in the judgment day and then get to be with him in heaven. I mean, it's almost like when God prophesies something in the Old Testament, a lot of times it'll be said as if it's already happened because he said it's going to happen. That's the kind of faith that we need to have. We speak about it as if it's already happened because we're so confident that what God says is going to come true. All right, any other thoughts?
This thing about Josephus, 25 years old, kind of bothers me.
Yeah?
Josephus, no doubt, knows more about the culture than I'll ever know about it, for sure. But I think about there in Matthew, the 19th chapter, when they were questioning about, divorce or remarriage, I guess. And it says in verse 4, 5, have you not read that he who made them in the beginning made them male and female? And he said, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother. So at this point is when and we might think like 21 years old in this poll that they're on their own. They got to make their, maybe even 18 years old, I guess, make their own decisions. And I think this is the point that it just seemed like to me Isaac didn't have this authority to question his dad to the point that he could make his own decisions. I think he had to leave the decision up to his father. So I'm just trying to figure out this age thing.
And that's an interesting point. Like I said, I don't know the actual age. That's just his reference point. But also, you got married older because you lived older and you had kids at an older age. I mean, um, I believe Isaac was in his 30s when he gets married, if I'm remembering properly. I'll have to do some review on that, but that is some more things to consider. We don't actually know for sure what age he was, but that's a good point. Okay. I was gonna take some time to talk about the faith and obedience aspect, but we don't have a ton of time. We will get to talk about that later, but just some passages for consideration, James 2, and then I had some verses in John that we could look at. But the point is that Abraham was a faithful man, but according to the end of verse 18, what was he accounted faithful for? Verse 18 of Genesis 22.
Obedience.
Yeah, he was accounted faithful because he obeyed the voice of the Lord. So just an interesting study that you should do on your own time, and I'd be happy to point out some verses. But all the accounts of it was counted as righteousness come from faith that obeys. All right. we're going to briefly finish up chapter 20, or verses 20 through 24, introduce Rebekah's genealogy, which will soon be the wife of Isaac later on, as we're going to see. But now let's spend just 4 minutes on chapter 3, and I know Yvette might kill me, but we'll end at 10:50, 10 till. Chapter 23, verses 1 through 19. This is very interesting because an entire chapter is dedicated to one thing. What happens in chapter 23? Sarah dies. And this is at the age of 127, according to verse 1. Why is this so significant? Why does she get an entire chapter? Well, let me ask you this also. Who else has an entire chapter dedicated just to their death?
Jesus.
Only Jesus. No one else. There are streams of verses, but no one else has this much room just dedicated to the death except for Jesus. And that's interesting because there are a few reasons that this would be here, and as a break from this continual story we've been seeing, just to see and talk about the death of Sarah, and that it's here to remind us about what we talked about last week. Sarah was the mother of nations just as Abraham was the father of nations. It was through Sarah and Abraham that these things were happening. They were both important in this relationship. And it talks about later the importance of Sarah in Galatians as she's used to be called or she's talked about as the side of the Spirit, the side of God, and Hagar, the side of sin and slavery. And she's also a very important figure in the lineage of Jesus. So there's this whole chapter dedicated just to her death to indicate just how important she was. And also, um, we can always look at her and say, well, she laughed at God when Isaac was born, or when Isaac was promised. So did Abraham. And Abraham, this is years later, had plenty of time to become the faithful man we just saw in chapter 22. And so, based on what's said about Sarah, we know that she was improving just as much as Abraham was. And they were both considered super important as followers of God. And so Abraham, at the end of chapter 23, purchases a tomb for her called the Cave of Machpelah. And this is also significant because this is the first land that Abraham actually owns in the Promised Land. All right, that's a brief summary of chapter 23. Any questions on anything from today or thoughts?
It's interesting to me, back to when it aspect of Mount Moriah, there's a statement, I just love it, in 2 Samuel 24, where David purchases this spot because God's given him direction to go get it for the building of the temple.
Mm-hmm.
And he goes to the threshing floor owner, Onan, and Jebusite, and he goes to purchase it, and he wants to give it to David with great piety, that whatever the king wants of me, that he can have everything I have. And David refuses and makes that famous statement, I will not give to my God anything that costs me nothing. And it's an interesting tie-in to David's attitude toward the sacrifice, that he was commanded to build an altar on that site. So there was no altar there. He goes to build an altar there, which will later be used as a center place of the temple itself. And Abraham's attitude of, I will not offer to God that which cost me nothing, because he did not go up onto the mountain with anything to offer. And it's almost a contrast, because he's counting on God to provide the sacrifice. Right?
That is an interesting
The
point.
question is, did Abraham know there would not be a goat at the top of that mountain for him to offer? And did he lie to Isaac on the way up?
I think he knew that Isaac was the sacrifice because in his mind, until God stopped him, Isaac was done and that he was going to be raised.
So I don't think he ever deceived Isaac with that. The way he chose to answer Isaac was the Lord would provide. He knew, just like David, he had the same heart as David. He wasn't going to offer anything on that altar that didn't cost him anything.
Right. And Isaac would have cost him everything.
He did not want a free goat trapped in the, unless that's what God said to do.
Mm.
He was willing to give his only son. Well, that cost him everything.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. And
that's what David's point was too. In a smaller way, I'm not gonna give anything free. I'm gonna give him of my own means.
Yeah. And that is a good point to bring out. And it is, I love that it's the same place where these significant things are done. And it's the place both times that God chose, not that they happened to be there. God directed it to be there. All right. And that will be it for today.
You were working on that time. So much was given to Abraham, but then make the other people. It really wasn't costing anything.
Well, I mean, that was probably the comforting thought. Of Abraham in the first
Yeah.
place.
If you would, please open up to 1 Samuel chapter 16. We're going to be turning a lot more in our Bibles this morning. That there will be more verses read in our Bibles than on the screen today. So 1 Samuel chapter 16. It is a wonderful grace and privilege to be here. I always feel so blessed getting to spend time with all of you. And I really do love it. I look forward to this. I get excited to being with you. I love what we get to do every Sunday of taking the Lord's Supper together. I love what was pointed out last week about how when we take the Lord's Supper, we're not just taking it with the group here. It's everyone all over who are a part of Christ on the first day of the week. It's something that unites us all in the memory and thoughts of one thing, and it's a really big blessing to do that. We're going to be talking about, well, we spent a few different services talking about the different attitudes we should have for different things. And this morning we're going to be talking again about the right kind of heart. But to start, I want to ask a couple of questions that we should be applying to ourselves and asking throughout this lesson. And the first of those is, what kind of person does God delight in? What brings him joy when he sees it in somebody? Is it when you're stronger or smarter than others? Is it when you are more handsome or more beautiful than someone else? Is it somebody who can speak well or who is extra creative or artistic? We live in a world that has a very twisted view of what is considered good qualities in a person. But more often than not, people make judgments on each other based on how you look or other people's opinions about you or your popularity and so before anything else. But that is not what God looks for when he's looking at a person. If we open our Bibles up to 1 Samuel 16, the passage I mentioned just a moment ago, we're going to see the exact problem in Samuel the prophet's view. God sends him out to find the next king of Israel, and he goes to Jesse and looks at all of his sons. And we come to Samuel in chapter 16, beginning in verse 6. So it was, when they came, that he looked at Eliab and said, "Surely the Lord's anointed is before him." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look at his appearance or at his physical stature, for I have refused him. For the Lord does not see as man sees. The Lord looks at the heart and not the outward appearance as man." Samuel goes to Jesse and he's looking for the son, and Jesse presents his firstborn named Eliab. And clearly, from Samuel's reaction, he was an impressive sight to see, whether that meant he was large and strong or tall and handsome. Whatever the case was, Samuel saw this man and thought, this has to be the next king. And he can't necessarily blame him either, because how was Saul described as king? He was a head and shoulders taller than everyone else. He looked like a mighty man at the time. And so Samuel automatically and, of course, wrongly assumes when seeing Eliab, this is the Lord's anointed. Who else could it be? But God says that it is not Eliab, and that Samuel should not base his judgments on people's physical stature or how good he looks. Why? For God does not see as man sees. He looked at the heart, and clearly Eliab wasn't the man that God wanted for the next king of Israel. And so Jesse then makes his other sons come through one at a time, and all of them are rejected by God. And then Samuel asks, because God tells him it's one of the sons of Jesse, he goes, "Well, then, are these all of your sons?" And Jesse goes, "Well, no, I have one more out in the field. He's shepherding. You wouldn't want to look at him. No big deal. But God tells him to bring him on over, or Samuel tells him to bring him one over. And it's funny to me because David was so unlikely, that's the youngest name, he was so unlikely to be chosen in the father's eyes at least, that he didn't even bother bringing him before Samuel. He thought all the other sons that he had a way better chance, so much so that he basically forgot about David, to the point where Samuel had to ask, "Are you sure that's all your sons?" And so David, the youngest, comes up, and we read in verse 6 or verse 12, "So he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy with bright eyes and good looking, and the Lord said, 'Arise, anoint him, for this is the one.'" But why did God choose David? At the time, Saul was the king of Israel, and he had chosen himself over God many times. And God was to the point where he was sorry that he had even made Saul king at all. 1 Samuel 15:11 says, this is God speaking, I greatly regret that I have set up Saul as king, for he has turned his back from following me and has not performed my commandments. And so God wanted something different from Saul, someone who would follow him, who wanted him just as badly as God wanted the person. And we're told that David would be that man. 1 Samuel 13:14. But now your kingdom shall not continue. This is talking to Saul. The Lord has sought for himself a man after his own heart. And the Lord has commanded him to be commander over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded. And we know, because David was chosen, that he was a man after God's own heart. We get a retelling of this account in Acts chapter 13, verse 22, which says, "And when he had removed him, he raised up for them David as king, to whom he also gave testimony and said, I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart, who will do my will." But I'd like to spend a few moments looking at what it actually means to be a person after God's own heart. And it all starts with having a real and personal love for God and a need to be in that close relationship with Him. And David had a living relationship with God. He wrote many psalms of praise for the Lord and of how much he loved and trusted the Lord. Psalm 63, verse 1, "O God, you are my God. Early I will seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh longs for you in a dry and thirsty land where there is no water." Does that sound like someone who casually talks to God at night before bed and right before he eats, and that's it? No. He looked at God as someone looks at water after being in the desert. He loved God. He longed for God. He wanted to be in His presence. He didn't serve God simply because he felt he had to, but because he truly wanted to out of love with all of his heart. He knew who the Lord was, and because of that, he was able to trust in Him entirely. He yearned for God all the time, praying often, sacrificing, and constantly worshiping Him in all that he did. Psalm 116, verse 1 and 2, "I love the Lord because He has heard my voice and my supplications, because He has inclined His ear to me. Therefore, I will call upon Him as long as I live." To be after God's own heart, there first has to be this real, serious love for Yahweh, the one true and living God. And then on top of that, it involves desiring what He desires, what God desires. David writes in Psalm 40 and verse 8, "I delight to do your will, O my God, and your law is within my heart." This is a person who hears God's commandments and then genuinely takes pleasure in doing them because he knows the God he loves has commanded it. And it isn't a burden or annoyance to this type of person because they know that obeying God brings him joy. It's not a reluctant obedience either, but an intense want, a real need to please the Lord and to do so in all parts of life. I love Psalm 1, and verse 2 says, "But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates sometimes, some days. No, day and night. It means that we have a heart and a mindset that totally reflects what God wants, and then a willingness, not just a willingness, but a joyful attitude to do it. But unfortunately, we know that no one is perfect. Even someone who is after God's own heart can stumble from time to time. However, those who do have this kind of heart that we're talking to respond to failure differently than those who don't. We're talking about David, and in Psalm 51, he comes to God repenting. Turn over to Psalm 51 if you would, and we're going to read a few verses there together. Psalm 51. The context of Psalm 51 is a really sad one. David has become king. This is later in 2 Samuel. And he looks upon a woman who is married, and he lies with her and ends up getting that woman's husband killed. You know the story of Bathsheba. And then in chapter 12 and 13, David is confronted by a prophet named Nathan. And Nathan tells him, look at how bad the things you've done are. And David, although he was temporarily blinded by lust and greed, his eyes are open and he does see the damage that he's done. And he repents and he turns to God immediately. And this is a psalm written about that. Psalm 51 and verse 3 says, "For I acknowledge my transgressions, and my sin is always before me." The type of person that we're talking about doesn't try to hide from their sin or shove it down to deal with later. They take responsibility for it. They respond to it with a heart of repentance. Look at verses 1 and 2. Have mercy upon me, O God, according to your loving kindness, according to the multitude of your tender mercies. Blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. Verse 7. Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. Hyssop, if you don't know right away, just in Leviticus, is used as a part of that purification ceremony. It was an effort to bring somebody back to that relationship with God. Verse 10, create in me a clean heart, O God. Create a steadfast spirit within me. And then finally, verse 12, restore to me the joy of your salvation and uphold me by your generous spirit. This type of person is a repenting person. We've talked about this type of repentance over and over, where it's a continual turning back to God, a wanting the restoration. And this is one who is willing to acknowledge the failures and then do everything that they can before God to get back on the path of righteousness, knowing that it is God above all who they have failed more than anything else, and wanting to fix that between them and to have it once again that wonderful relationship. A person who is after God's own heart is one whose whole life is given to him because they love him and they want to please him. And if you've ever read through David's story, through his whole life's account in the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel and the Kings and Chronicles, you know that he was a man who devoted his life to God and everything that he did. And so, if you really want to know what it is to have a heart that is like God's, and you really want to please him, then David is the perfect example for us to look at this morning. He is one who gave everything to God, he was humble, he was wise, and he obeyed. And so, let's take a few minutes to actually look at what it is to live with this kind of heart. How does it affect you in your day-to-day life? Does it make things easier? How does it affect your thinking in your everyday moments, in your big decisions? And how can it affect us now based on that? And there are four major things that I'll point out. Of course, there are lots of other changes that this heart brings. But there are four major things I'd like to look at that we can see in the life of David. And the first is that you can become fearless. David was given the title, a man after God's heart, for a reason. As we've already said many times, everything he did, he genuinely lived in the light of God because he loved and trusted him. And because of that love and trust, he was able to become fearless. Oops, I'm one behind. Turn back to 1 Samuel 17. We'll be in 1 Samuel a lot if you want to put your marker there. 1 Samuel 17 is where we're going to read in just a moment. David knew that the Lord would watch over him because of his trust in him. And since he had such a reliance on God, we see over and over again that David was able to take courage no matter what the odds were against him. In 1 Samuel 17, we have the story of David facing up against Goliath. At this point, he's just a shepherd's boy, although we know he's been anointed in chapter 16. He's still living as a shepherd with his father. Israel has gone to war against the Philistines, and they're facing off in the valley of Elah. And David's father, Jesse, sends him to his brothers to bring food and bread. And David comes on to a horrific scene of the Philistines on one side and the Israelites on the other side of this valley. And he happens to see Goliath come in and make these threats to the Israelite army. He tells them, "If just one of you will fight me and take me down, whoever wins is enslaved by the winner, or whoever loses is enslaved by the winner, and we don't have to fight this battle." And then on top of that, Goliath goes on to insult the Yahweh and his armies. And David hears this and he's appalled. He sees the armies of God cowering on their side of the camp. And he wasn't worried or fearful about the opposing army or Goliath's size. He was angry. Look at verse 26 of chapter 17, what David says when he hears this. Then David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" He's angry. He asks, what shall be done for the man who would do this? Who is allowing this Philistine, someone who was supposed to be wiped out a long time ago, to defy the armies of the living God? And so what does he do when he sees this terrible situation? As the youngest of all his brothers, he says, "Okay, I'll do it myself. I'll take care of Goliath." Let's read a couple of verses beginning in verse 32 together. Then David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are a youth, and he is a man of war from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep his father's sheep, and when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after it, and struck it, and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose against me, I caught it by its beard, and struck it, and killed me. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing that he has defiled the armies of the living God." Moreover, David said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." So Saul clothed David with his armor, and he put a bronze helmet on his head, and he clothed him with a coat of mail. David fastened his sword to his armor and tried to walk, for he had not tested them. And David said to Saul, "I cannot walk with these, for I have not tested them." So David took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from a brook, and put them in the shepherd's bag in a pouch which he had, and a sling in his hand. And he drew near to the Philistine. Just as a side note, when it comes to the armor being tested, before you went to war, you normally trained in your armor so that it was molded to where your arms moved and you knew what it was going to do when you swung a sword, and you could be confident in that armor. That's important because what we're going to see later, David said he could not be confident in Saul's armor or Saul's sword because he had not tested it. So then everyone else sitting there scared and hiding, David goes out before this Philistine. And I love what the text emphasizes is David's just a youth, but Goliath, this giant, is a man of war from his youth. To everyone, this was an impossible battle. David was going to his death. And yet he did not slow down. And he goes out there not even with a sword or with armor, just a sling and 5 stones from a brook, and he kills Goliath. David comes before this giant before he kills him, and I'd like to read just these 3 verses. In verse 45, then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Almighty God of hosts, the God of armies of Israel, whom you have defiled. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel." Verse 47. Then all the assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. Because David trusted in the Lord, and unlike the armor we mentioned earlier, he had proved the Lord. He had been with the Lord and worked with the Lord. He could trust the Lord, and he could stand in the face of inconceivable odds fearlessly and win. And I love this because it's not just that it happened against Goliath. As we continue to read about David, this is going to happen over and over where he's outnumbered. And he remembers it's not a battle of sword or spear, it's in the Lord's hands. But the next thing is led right off of that. Because he was fearless, he was able to stand firm in all things with God. He did not compromise in his belief, even if he was pressured or had plenty of opportunity to do so. Most of the time, of course, as we know. Turn over to 1 Samuel chapter 24. So by this point, a lot has happened since chapter 17. David and Saul have fought many battles together, but also the people started to love David. And remember, he is God's officially new anointed king. The people begin to sing songs about David after our last event, where it says Saul killed his thousands, but David has killed his 10,000s. The favor went to David. Saul had promised David that he could marry his oldest daughter. He promised him all of these positions in the kingdom and all of these things. But in this short period of time, Saul has tried to kill David. He is now chasing David around. He is spreading lies about David, attacking those who help David. David is now in fear, hiding in caves from Saul. And this is where we come to in chapter 24. Let's begin reading in verse 1. Now it happened when Saul had returned from following the Philistines that it was told him, saying, "Take note, David is in the wilderness of En-gedi." Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men from all Israel and went to seek David and his men on the rocks of the wild goats. So he came to the sheepfolds by the road where there was a cave, and Saul went in to attend to his needs. David and his men were staying in the recesses of that cave. Then the men of David said to him, "This is the day of which the Lord said to you, 'Behold, I will deliver your enemy into your hand, that you may do to him as it seems good to you.'" And David arose secretly and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Now it happened afterward that David's heart troubled him, because he had cut Saul's robe. And he said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch out my hand against him, seeing that he is the anointed of the Lord." We just talked about all that David had to deal with when running from Saul, all the things that Saul has done to David. And he's given this opportunity, a perfect opportunity that any other person would take, to kill the person who's been chasing them for so long, who's been lying against them, who is hurting them, and who is actively defying God by reigning as king. And he doesn't do it. Instead, as we see in the text, he took a part of his robe. But even to David, that seemed like a defiance. That was too far. He had gone against the Lord's anointed. And I love that it says his heart troubled him. And so he goes out to this king who's looking for him to kill him, laid bare with this robe to tell him what happened. And Saul says in verse 17, "Then he said to David, 'You are more righteous than I, for you have rewarded me with good whereas I have rewarded you with evil. And you have shown this day how you have dealt well with me, for the Lord delivered me into your hand, and you did not kill me. It would have been so easy for David to kill Saul and end all of this. He would have been anointed as king, and he could have taken that luxury life that comes with it, instead of living in caves running. But David stood on his conviction and would not lift a hand against the Lord's anointed. He knew what was right, and even when everything, literally everything, including the people around him, told him to do evil, he would not do it. And even Saul saw how he was rewarded with righteousness, even though he gave out evil. And as we've seen so far, this leads us right into our next point. In all that David did, because he had the Lord first, he behaved wisely. Turn to 1 Samuel chapter 18. We'll be reading a few verses there. And this is a huge factor for us who are striving to have the heart that is like God's. 1 Samuel 18, we'll read verse 5 at first. 1 Samuel 18, verse 5. So David went out wherever Saul sent him, and behaved wisely. And Saul set him over the men of war, and he was accepted in the sight of all the people, and in the sight of Saul's servant. Now down a few verses in verse 14. And David behaved wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. One more time in this chapter, verse 30. Then the princes of the Philistines went out to war. So it was, whenever they went out, that David behaved more wisely than all the servants of Saul, so that his name became highly esteemed. The Proverbs talk so much about behaving wisely if we're going to be servants of God, and exactly how we should do that. And David walked in the wisdom of the Lord. He prayed about his decisions before whatever big thing that he was about to do to make sure that they were the right ones. In 1 Samuel 23:2, before a battle, he says, Therefore David inquired of the Lord. Then, same thing, 1 Samuel 30, verse 8. Again, another battle. So David inquired of the Lord. Another example, 2 Samuel 5:19, again against the Philistines. Before anything happened, David inquired of the Lord. He wanted to know what God thought before he acted. And then he strove to make the best choices in every situation based on what pleased God. And all, as we were able to see in chapter 18, everyone, even his enemies, were able to see that he was wise. And going right along with that, the next and last thing that we're going to look at is that everyone knew God was with him. If you want to turn back to chapter 18, all of those different events we just read about, we have examples of those same people, what they thought about David, aside from his wisdom. Verse 12, now Saul was afraid of David. Why? Because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. Chapter 18, verse 28. Thus Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. And one more example, chapter 24 and verse 20. Chapter 24, verse 20. And now I know indeed that you shall surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand. David lived in a way, doing all of these things in a way that all who laid eyes on him, who interacted with him, even those who fought against him, knew that the Lord was with him, and they could see the wisdom that it brought. And it brought respect, it brought fear, and it brought people to God. Being after God's own heart meant that he was able to be fearless, stand firm, use the wisdom that God provides, and in doing so, show the world what living with God could look like, and how much stronger God is than anything or anyone else. His heart the heart that God searched for in 1 Samuel 13 was revealed by his life. And we should all strive to live in this same way as people after God's own heart. Live so that the people that we are around can see there's something different. God is a part of this person's life. So that they can look at our decisions and see wisdom and not the chaos that's in the world. But to do this, to live in a way that others know God through us, we have to make hard decisions. And so for our last few minutes, I just want to look at the idea of getting that heart that is like God's. How can we do it? And the first thing I would like to look at is that it all starts with what we've already talked about a little. Loving and trusting the Lord like David did. But love is not just a feeling as so many people have dumbed it down to. It's an active choice. It is that choice to put God first in our thoughts, in our actions, and in every part of our lives, and then to keep him there. Jesus said that the greatest commandment was in Matthew 22:33, you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your strength. Not some of it, not some of the time, but a continual putting him first always with everything that you have. David made that choice to do it in Psalm 18, verse 1, just one of many Psalms that David writes this about. I will love you, O my Lord, my strength. That's David choosing to love God. We can't expect to have a heart like God's if we do not constantly do just that, choosing to put him before anything else. And it is much more than simply telling God that you love him in prayer. It is making decisions and seeking that living relationship with him, one that involves constant communication through prayer and through reading of the scriptures, one where you are seeking his wisdom and inquiring of the word before you make your big decisions, praying that he help you make the right one, and choosing that no matter what, you're going to do what God's word says to do, even if it feels wrong in the moment. That's loving and trusting God. And it's not just choosing to love him. As has already been implied by what we're talking about, it's choosing to follow the path that he's put before all of us. That the world offers so many different roads, and they say they all lead to the same place, or that it leads to nothing. But God puts one road that will lead you to him, and he expects those who love him to follow it. And a heart that is like God's is committed to only that small, narrow, and winding path found in Matthew chapter 7. It is a heart that can say, I will walk in your ways, O God, even when life is hard and I don't understand. Psalm 119, verse 30, I have chosen the way of truth. Your judgments I have laid before me. David had many opportunities to leave the righteous path and take a shortcut to power or even leave the throne altogether. He could have done any of those things. But instead, even though it was much harder, he followed God's way, the righteous way, to becoming king. And one who is really devoted follows that way, his word, rather than our own feelings. Psalm 119, 105, your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. We are always going to have good and bad choices before us that we can make. But that person who has the heart of God is going to choose God. But in order to do that, I want to suggest two things. We need to actually practice choosing good when times are easy, when we're alone, or when we're in places like we are today, where there will be people all around you encouraging you to do right. Things like choosing to read your Bible or to spend time meeting together studying the Word on Sunday morning before we worship, or doing extra activities outside of the assembly to meet with your Christian brethren. Those things are easy. There are people there who will encourage you, who will love you to be there, who will encourage you to pray, to read your Bible. So why not take those opportunities to practice the easy things before times get hard? Praying alone in your room. You know, when you think of Daniel, he often went to pray alone, even when he was strictly commanded not to go and pray to God. Jesus prayed every morning and every night and all throughout the day and often sought time to pray alone. And that was before his final week and before things got really bad for him. He always did that. David's faith wasn't founded when he went to face Goliath. He had already been faithful to God when he was shepherding in the fields for his life. He was faithful to God before the lion and the bear attacked. And so when the lion and the bear attacked, he was able to kill them. Practice being faithful when it's easy so that you can stand when it's hard. If we only pray in time of crisis, we miss the strong and intimate relationship that we're called to have with our Lord. So many people, I mean, it really is common for people to wait until desperate times or crisis before they pray to God. And sometimes that has to happen for people to get to where they're praying to God. But we shouldn't let that be the only time we do it. Psalm 63, verses 5 and 6. My soul shall be satisfied as with marrow and with fatness, and my mouth shall praise you with joyful lips. When I remember you on my bed, I meditate on you in the night watches. David didn't seek God only when things were bad. He trained himself to remember and meditate on the Lord in all times. In the early morning, as we read earlier, and late at night on his bed. And that is how a heart truly becomes aligned with the Lord. It's what we have to do. And the last thing, as David was able to do, because he was faithfully practicing doing God's will in easy times, he was able to stand strong when it came to difficult times. And that's the same for us. As we have seen many times, it did get difficult for David, and yet he says in Psalm 55, as for me, I will call upon the Lord, and the Lord shall save me. Evening and morning and at noon I will pray and cry aloud, and he shall hear my voice. When we come to times when it's difficult, and we will come to times where we have difficult choices to make or things are going wrong for us. We will be faced with ridicule, mockery, and in some places, harm. We have to be ready. Psalm 27:14. Wait on the Lord, be of good courage. He shall strengthen your heart. Wait, I say, on the Lord. And I'd also like to point out that sometimes standing strong doesn't mean that you feel strong. It doesn't mean that you have all the answers. There are tons of times where prophets and men of God had no idea what was going on. But they stood strong because they trusted in the Lord to overcome it. I mean, we looked at Abraham this morning. He didn't know what was going to happen for sure with Isaac, but he trusted in God to take care of his promises. And we saw the result of that. It is always easy to trust God when it's good. But we won't be able to trust God when it's bad if we haven't been building that foundation. And David, in his life, never said that I understand everything that's happening. But he did say in Psalm 18, the Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer. My God, my strength, in whom I will trust, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. Be after God's own heart means that even when the storm comes, whatever it is, we can stand firm on the rock, the stronghold that is Yahweh our God. The Lord is always looking for people who will imitate his heart, to do the things that we've looked at today. My question is, are you willing to put in the work to become that kind of person? We've been seeing in the book of Genesis how it does take time and it does take work, but every time we choose God, we get closer to him. We become stronger. We can be faithful. And Abraham was even called the friend of God. So let's remember this week to take time to pray. Take time to read the Word. I don't think there's any major catastrophic event happening. I mean, there's a lot going on in the world, don't get me wrong. But I don't think there's anything stopping us from doing any of those things right now. And so take the time to become strong while you can so that when something does come against us, we're able to rely on the Lord who we've trusted all this time. And if there's anything at all that I can help you to do to get there, whether it's studying the Word however long, whether it's praying with you, whatever it is, Brother Larry, Brother Martin, Kirk, all of these men here, all of the women here would love to help you do so. But let us know that you want to get closer to God, and let us help you. If you are also here this morning and you're not a part of God's kingdom, but you see the wonderful works that God does for all of those who are His, and you want to become a part of that, and you want to imitate His heart, and I encourage you to come to the front today so that we can help you as together we stand and as we sing.
Angels are singing, praise that sweet song.